Today's announcement of a faith-based initiative is not the only overture Obama is making to the evangelical movement. Over the next 4 months, his supporters are planning up to 1,000 house parties and dozens of Christian rock concerts, as well as holding campus visits, conference calls, and meetings with religious leaders. This despite the fact that the latest NBC Wall Street Journal poll from last month put Senator McCain at a 69% to 21% advantage over Obama, with people identifying themselves as evangelicals. However, that is a full 10% less evangelical support than President Bush had in 2004. So does Obama have a chance to woo at least some of them away from the Republican Party, and is the price he'd have to pay worth it? Joining me now to help answer that question, the Executive Director of the Americans United for Separation of Church and State, Reverend Barry Lynn. Thanks for your time tonight, sir.
Nice to be here.
The announcement today that he would intensify Mr. Bush's faith-based initiatives, balancing church and state, is that a good idea or is it a bad idea?
Well, it's always a good idea when you have someone talking about the separation of church and state and having some demonstrated support for it in the past. That's a good thing when he says his program will not allow discriminatory hiring with the very tax dollars that are coming from all of the people and that might end up in a religious community. Those are all steps in the right direction. But you really have to ask the question, why not just go back to the way it was before this president's faith-based initiative, which is nothing more than a kind of 21st century version of walking around money, paying your friends or luring your friends into things in the expectation they'll get money. But before that, there were all kinds of community partnerships between religious organizations and government, but they didn't discriminate in hiring or in accepting volunteers to distribute the food. They were engaged in secular services. They kept it segregated from their religious function. Why not just go back to that system, do it that way, and get rid of this idea that you have a separate office sitting near the White House to help people be religious? We don't need that in this country.
And to that point, Obama's ground rules for these federal grants would be no proselytizing. Religion can't be used as a factor in hiring, which you mentioned. Same accountability as grants to non-religious outfits. I imagine that the third would be pretty easy to accomplish and to sort of supervise. But the first two, especially in the light of the last 20 or 30 years, no proselytizing, no religious litmus test for hiring. Are these things not, to some degree, antithetical to nearly all religions, no matter how positive their intentions are?
No, it is a big problem. It's very difficult for a religious group that takes its faith seriously to turn off the spigot of spirituality whenever some federal dollar comes floating by and then turn it back on with the private dollars. That is a serious problem. One way to correct it is you form a separate little nonprofit agency associated with your church. It makes it easy for transparency purposes to see where the money's come from, where it's going, and you don't have to get into problems of auditing the churches, auditing all of their books. It's good for the church, it's good for the state, and it's very good for the taxpayers, because we've seen some abominable programs, some of which we have sued successfully over the past 7 years, where this proselytizing has gotten way out of control using money that comes from the American taxpayer.
Reverend Lynn, politically, it's pretty obvious who Obama could lose with this, I think. Is it obvious that there are people out there he could gain? Do they exist, or do they just exist in his perception?
Okay, it's not a complete mythological kingdom, but this idea that there are conservative evangelicals who somehow really worry more about the environment and vote that way than worry about his position on abortion or gay rights, it's a very slim segment of the pie of the American voter. There's no demonstration that the so-called hardline religious right, 17 to 18% of American voters since the 1970s, are going away. We did some studies of the income from the top 15 religious right groups. 14 of them made more money last year than the year before. You combine that with Mike Huckabee, the perfect social issues candidate for the religious right. He won 8 states in primaries. He got 36% of the vote in Texas the day that he dropped out of the race. I mean, those folks are still there. I've talked to some of them just this afternoon. The truth is, they say abortion, gay rights, prayer in the schools, those are the issues they're going to vote on. Many of them, frankly, are a little suspicious about the faith-based initiative. They were when they saw David Quo and others criticize the issue.
Reverend Barry Lynn, Executive Director of the Americans United for Separation of Church and State. Great thanks for your insight and your time, sir. Thank you.